They searched for 2 weeks. Helicopters, search dogs, hundreds of volunteers combing Olympic National Forest. Found nothing. Brandon and Dylan Mitchell had vanished completely. But in 2016, 12 years later, a logger discovered their campsite just miles from where search teams had concentrated efforts. The tent was modified. The fire ring showed months of use, and scratched into bark were 2 words that changed everything. Forest kept us. The morning mist rolled through Washington's Olympic National Forest like a ghost on September the 15th, 2004, swallowing every sound, turning familiar trails into pathways to nowhere. A father and his teenage son drove into those mountains for what should have been 4 simple days of camping. Neither would ever be seen alive again. What happened in that wilderness defied every logical explanation. Search teams would comb thousands of acres and find nothing. Not a trace, not a clue, not a single shred of evidence. The forest had swallowed them whole. For 12 years, their disappearance remained one of the Pacific Northwest's most haunting mysteries. Then a logging crew stumbled onto something buried deep in the backcountry. What they found rewrote everything, because Brandon and Dylan Mitchell didn't just vanish, they survived. And the truth about their final days proved more disturbing than anyone imagined. Brandon Mitchell checked his watch one last time before pulling out of the driveway. 6:30 in the morning, right on schedule. At 42, Brandon lived his entire life by the clock. Insurance adjuster, single father, weekend outdoorsman, every moment planned, every detail accounted for. His co-workers at Pacific Northwest Insurance knew him as the man who never missed a deadline, never forgot a detail, never failed to follow through. That methodical nature had earned him promotions and respect. It had also ended his marriage. Megan grew tired of rigid schedules, inflexible routines, the inability to simply be spontaneous. But this trip was different. This wasn't about schedules. This was about reconnecting with the son he barely knew anymore. About bridging a gap that widened with each passing month since the divorce. Brandon had watched Dylan pulling away, becoming a stranger who happened to share his DNA. The kid who used to beg to go camping had transformed into a teenager who barely looked up from screens, who communicated in grunts, who resented every moment away from friends and gaming consoles. Dylan sat in the passenger seat, 17 years old and worlds away, earbuds dangling from his neck, flip phone gripped tight like a lifeline to the world he was leaving behind. The kid hadn't wanted to come. He'd argued for weeks, thrown every excuse at his father, school projects, friends, a gaming tournament, but Brandon had insisted. Eventually, Dylan gave in with the resigned acceptance of a teenager who knew he'd lost. The drive from Seattle toward Olympic National Forest took them west, through winding roads that climbed steadily into remote mountain territory. Brandon tried making conversation, pointed out landmarks from his teenage years, shared stories about camping trips with his father, stories about catching his first fish, about learning to start a fire without matches, about the night he'd seen a black bear and felt his heart nearly explode. Dylan offered grunts and one-word answers, his attention locked on the cell phone that would soon become useless. Signal bars dropped steadily as they climbed higher. 4 bars became 3, then 2, then one flickering bar that finally disappeared. Dylan stared at the screen like he'd lost a friend, his thumb automatically refreshing the signal indicator. Brandon smiled to himself. This was exactly what the kid needed. Distance from the digital world, time in nature, space to remember what actually mattered. Their destination was Silver Lake, a remote alpine body of water accessible only by logging roads that hadn't seen maintenance in years. Brandon had been coming to this area since he was Dylan's age. He knew the trails, knew the campsites, knew exactly where to find the perfect spot. Or at least he thought he did. They reached the trailhead just after noon, parked their silver Honda Civic in a small dirt clearing surrounded by towering Douglas firs. Brandon had packed with military precision, tent rated for 4-season camping, sleeping bags designed for temperatures down to 15 degrees, cooking equipment, enough food for a week even though they'd only planned 4 days. He believed in preparation, in being ready for anything. Dylan shouldered his lighter backpack with obvious reluctance, adjusting the straps multiple times, complaining about the weight even though Brandon had deliberately packed the heavier items in his own bag. But something shifted as they started hiking. The forest had a way of doing that, of pulling you in despite yourself, of making you forget whatever petty concerns you'd brought from civilization. The trail wound through old-growth timber, past moss-covered logs, past crystal-clear streams that sang over smooth stones. Brandon led the way, his pace steady and confident, occasionally stopping to point out animal tracks pressed into soft mud. Deer, raccoon, possibly bear, though he didn't mention that. He explained the geology of the region, how glaciers had carved these valleys thousands of years ago, how the mountains were still slowly rising. Dylan followed, his initial complaints gradually fading as genuine curiosity took over. He started asking questions. What kind of trees were those? How did you know which mushrooms were safe? Had Brandon ever gotten lost out here? By the time they reached Silver Lake 3 hours later, even the teenager had to admit the view was worth the hike. The water spread before them like polished glass, reflecting snow-capped peaks in perfect mirror image. Their campsite sat on a small peninsula jutting into the lake, surrounded by ancient trees and absolute silence. The kind of silence you never heard in the city. That first evening passed like a dream. They set up the tent together, Brandon showing Dylan the proper way to stake the corners, how to create tension in the rainfly. They gathered firewood, Dylan learning to distinguish between softwood and hardwood. They cooked dinner over open flames, instant ramen elevated to gourmet status by hunger and fresh mountain air. Dylan actually put his phone away voluntarily, acknowledging what his father had known all along. Out here, that device was nothing but dead weight. They talked that night. Really talked. For the first time in months. No arguments about grades, no fights about curfew, no tension about college applications. Dylan offered grunts and one-word answers, his attention locked on the cell phone that would soon become useless. Signal bars dropped steadily as they climbed higher. 4 bars became 3, then 2, then one flickering bar that finally disappeared. Dylan stared at the screen like he'd lost a friend, his thumb automatically refreshing the signal indicator. Brandon smiled to himself. This was exactly what the kid needed. Distance from the digital world, time in nature, space to remember what actually mattered. Their destination was Silver Lake, a remote alpine body of water accessible only by logging roads that hadn't seen maintenance in years. Brandon had been coming to this area since he was Dylan's age. He knew the trails, knew the campsites, knew exactly where to find the perfect spot. Or at least he thought he did. They reached the trailhead just after noon, parked their silver Honda Civic in a small dirt clearing surrounded by towering Douglas firs. Brandon had packed with military precision, tent rated for 4-season camping, sleeping bags designed for temperatures down to 15 degrees, cooking equipment, enough food for a week even though they'd only planned 4 days. He believed in preparation, in being ready for anything. Dylan shouldered his lighter backpack with obvious reluctance, adjusting the straps multiple times, complaining about the weight even though Brandon had deliberately packed the heavier items in his own bag. But something shifted as they started hiking. The forest had a way of doing that, of pulling you in despite yourself, of making you forget whatever petty concerns you'd brought from civilization. The trail wound through old-growth timber, past moss-covered logs, past crystal-clear streams that sang over smooth stones. Brandon led the way, his pace steady and confident, occasionally stopping to point out animal tracks pressed into soft mud. Deer, raccoon, possibly bear, though he didn't mention that. He explained the geology of the region, how glaciers had carved these valleys thousands of years ago, how the mountains were still slowly rising. Dylan followed, his initial complaints gradually fading as genuine curiosity took over. He started asking questions, real questions. What kind of trees were those? How did you know which mushrooms were safe? Had Brandon ever gotten lost out here? By the time they reached Silver Lake 3 hours later, even the teenager had to admit the view was worth the hike. The water spread before them like polished glass, reflecting snow-capped peaks in perfect mirror image. Their campsite sat on a small peninsula jutting into the lake, surrounded by ancient trees and absolute silence. The kind of silence you never heard in the city. That first evening passed like a dream. They set up the tent together, Brandon showing Dylan the proper way to stake the corners, how to create tension in the rainfly. They gathered firewood, Dylan learning to distinguish between softwood and hardwood. They cooked dinner over open flames, instant ramen elevated to gourmet status by hunger and fresh mountain air. Dylan actually put his phone away voluntarily, acknowledging what his father had known all along. Out here, that device was nothing but dead weight. They talked that night. Really talked. For the first time in months. No arguments about grades. No fights about curfew. No tension about college applications. They'd have to spend the night in the woods with only the emergency supplies they'd brought for the day hike. Brandon tried to make the best of it. They found a small clearing, gathered branches and used their emergency tarp to construct a crude shelter against a large hemlock. They rationed their limited supplies. A single energy bar split between them, water sipped carefully from bottles that would be empty by morning. Dylan handled it better than Brandon expected, gathering firewood without complaint, asking practical questions about their next move. The kid was showing a resilience Brandon hadn't known was there. That night stretched endlessly. They took turns feeding their small fire, knowing they couldn't let it die completely. Strange sounds echoed through the darkness, branches snapping under unseen weight. Something large moving through the underbrush just beyond their fire's reach. Close enough they could hear breathing, but couldn't see anything in the absolute blackness. The cry of an owl that seemed to come from multiple directions at once. Brandon reassured his son that these were normal forest sounds, that there was nothing to fear, but privately something felt deeply wrong. The wilderness around them seemed more alive, more aware than it should have been. He'd spent years hiking these mountains and had never felt anything like this oppressive presence. This sense that they'd crossed some invisible boundary into territory where humans weren't meant to venture. Dawn brought hope that quickly faded. Brandon was certain they could retrace their steps, find familiar ground, make it back to the lake. They broke camp early, carefully marking their path with broken branches and stacked rocks to avoid walking in circles. But as hours passed, their situation only worsened. The forest grew thicker, the terrain more challenging, the landmarks more confusing. They found themselves in areas that shouldn't exist according to the Tsar. Steep ravines cutting through what should have been gentle slopes. Rocky outcroppings appearing where topographic lines indicated soft soil. By day 3, water became a critical problem. They'd found a small stream, clear water rushing over smooth stones. But Brandon hesitated to drink without purification tablets. He'd read too many stories about giardia, about intestinal parasites, about bacterial infections from water that looked perfectly safe. But Dylan was showing signs of dehydration. His lips were cracked. His skin had lost its healthy colour, his movements becoming sluggish. Brandon made the decision. They'd drink from the stream, risk the potential illness that might come later, because dying of dehydration in the next few days was a more immediate threat. What started as a father-son camping trip had become a survival situation neither was truly prepared for. Brandon tried everything he could think of. He climbed trees trying to spot the lake, scraped his hands raw on rough bark. From the highest point he could reach, he could see nothing but endless acres of green forest canopy. He built signal fires hoping aircraft might notice, gathered green branches that would produce thick white smoke. But the forest canopy was too dense, and he saw no planes overhead anyway. This area was too remote. He even tried to follow what looked like old trails, only to have them vanish into impenetrable thicket. Paths that seemed to lead somewhere and then simply ended. Each failure deepened his sense of panic and crushing guilt. He'd brought his son out here. This was his responsibility, his failure. If something happened to Dylan, if they died out here because of his overconfidence, he'd never forgive himself. Meanwhile, back in Seattle, Megan Phillips was starting to worry. Brandon's ex-wife had moved on from their marriage emotionally, but she still cared about Brandon as the father of her child. More importantly, she cared desperately about their son. When Sunday evening came and went with no sign of either of them, she told herself not to panic. Men lost track of time on camping trips. Brandon would show up Monday morning with apologies, but Monday morning arrived without word. Brandon never missed work. It was one of his defining characteristics. He never broke promises about Dylan's schedule. Their custody arrangement was sacred to him. This wasn't like him at all. By Monday afternoon, worry transformed into genuine alarm. She tried calling his cell phone repeatedly. Every attempt went straight to voicemail, his cheerful recorded greeting beginning to sound like a taunt. She contacted Brandon's office, but his colleagues were equally confused. His secretary, Nicole Barnes, was visibly worried. She confirmed he'd been excited about the camping trip, had talked about it for weeks, but he had given no indication it would run longer than planned. His desk calendar showed meetings scheduled for Tuesday morning. By Tuesday morning, Megan was making frantic calls to every authority she could think of. Park services, local police, search and rescue, but she faced an immediate problem. Brandon had been vague about their exact destination. Just a camping trip, he'd said. Silver Lake area, he'd mentioned. They'd be fine. But now that vagueness was a nightmare. Olympic National Forest covered nearly 1 million acres. Silver Lake could refer to 6 different bodies of water. Search teams couldn't just randomly comb that entire wilderness. The search began in earnest Wednesday morning after Brandon's Honda Civic was located at a remote trailhead by a park ranger. The vehicle sat unlocked, keys in the ignition. Inside, everything appeared normal. Dylan's extra clothes folded neatly, Brandon's meticulous camping checklist on the dashboard. Every item checked off. No signs of struggle, no indication of foul play. Just 2 people who'd parked their car, shouldered their packs, and walked into the forest, never to return. The discovery transformed vague worry into concrete crisis. This was real. They were truly missing, and the clock was ticking. Search and rescue protocols kicked into high gear. Search dogs arrived that afternoon. German shepherds trained to track human scent across impossible terrain. Samantha Ward, a 15-year veteran, brought her best tracking team. 3 dogs, each with dozens of successful finds. If Brandon and Dylan had left a trail, these dogs would find it. And initially they did. The dogs picked up the scent immediately, followed it confidently along what appeared to be Brandon and Dylan's route toward the lake. But 6 miles in, something inexplicable happened. The dogs stopped. Not gradually, they simply stopped. All 3 animals at almost the same instant, as if they'd hit an invisible wall. They circled the same spot repeatedly, whining in obvious distress. "I've never seen anything like it," Samantha told investigators. "These animals can follow scent for days under the worst circumstances, but here, it's like the trail just vanished into thin air." She knelt beside her lead dog, Duke, a German shepherd who'd successfully tracked over 40 missing persons. The dog trembled under her hands, his ears flat against his skull, his tail tucked. He kept pulling back toward the trail they'd just covered, whining in a pitch she'd never heard from him before. The weather had been schlipped since Brandon and Dylan's disappearance. No rain to wash away scent, no snow to cover tracks. There was no logical reason for the scent to disappear so completely. Ground teams expanded the search from that point, fanning out in every direction. They covered 20 miles in a grid pattern. Experienced searchers walking arm's length apart. Volunteers poured in from surrounding communities. Brandon's co-workers formed their own search party. Dylan's high school friends showed up despite having no experience. Even people who'd never met either of them wanted to help. The terrain fought them every step. Steep ravines, dense old-growth timber, rocky slopes, and everywhere the forest seemed to close in on itself. Paths disappeared, landmarks shifted, directions became meaningless. Helicopters flew grid patterns overhead, searching for any sign of the missing campers, bright camping gear, smoke from emergency fires, any disturbance in the forest canopy, but the dense canopy made spotting anything nearly impossible. They found nothing, just endless acres of green. As days became weeks, official search efforts began scaling back. Resources were finite. The chances of finding anyone alive after 2 weeks approached 0. Statistics were brutally clear. After 72 hours, survival rates dropped dramatically. After a week, single digits. After 2 weeks, you weren't conducting a rescue. You were conducting a recovery. At a press conference Megan would remember forever, the search coordinator explained the reality. They weren't giving up. The case would remain open. But they had to acknowledge the statistical improbability of finding Brandon and Dylan alive. Resources needed to be allocated to other emergencies. Megan stood in the back and felt rage building. How dare they give up? How dare they reduce her son to statistics? Turn him into just another cold case file? She organised her own search parties, recruiting anyone willing to spend weekends combing remote areas. She studied topographical maps obsessively, covered her dining room walls with them, learned wilderness survival techniques from books and online forums, became an expert in terrain navigation. Her house became a command centre. Walls covered with maps and photos, her dining room table disappeared under stacks of manuals and case files. Local media covered the story extensively at first. Television crews filmed dramatic helicopter footage, interviewed tearful family members. Brandon's brother Hunter became the family spokesman. "My brother was the most careful person I knew," he said in one interview. "He planned everything down to the last detail. Whatever happened out there, it wasn't carelessness. Something else is at play here." But as leads dried up and other tragedies demanded attention, coverage faded. The missing father and son became another statistic. The investigation revealed nothing suspicious. Brandon's finances were stable. His relationship with Megan remained cordial. Dylan was a typical teenager with typical problems, nothing suggesting he might run away. Both had been looking forward to the trip. The first anniversary brought renewed attention and fresh search efforts. New technology provided tools that hadn't been available. Thermal imaging, ground-penetrating radar, sonar sweeps of every accessible body of water. For a few weeks, hope flickered again, but the results were the same: nothing. The forest kept its secrets. Dylan's 18th birthday passed, marked only by his mother's private grief. She sat in his room that day, surrounded by posters of bands he'd loved and video games he'd never finish. College acceptance letters arrived at a house where he would never return. University of Washington, Seattle Pacific, even Stanford. His bedroom remained exactly as he'd left it, a shrine to a life interrupted. By year 3, even Megan's closest supporters worried about her mental health. She'd lost weight dramatically, aged beyond her years. Her job performance suffered. She'd taken leave, then reduced to part-time, then finally resigned. She joined online forums for families of missing persons, finding both comfort and obsession. She learned about other cases, other families trapped in the same horrible limbo. Local tribal elders shared stories about that region when approached respectfully. Some areas were sacred, they explained, places where the boundary between physical and spiritual worlds grew thin. The forest has its own spirit, Agnes Clearwater told Megan during one conversation. The respected elder had lived in the region 76 years. Sometimes it calls people deeper than they meant to go. Sometimes it keeps them. We've always known this, but others rarely listen until too late. The forest doesn't follow your rules. Agnes shared stories passed down through generations. Tales of hunters who'd ventured too far and returned changed, if they returned at all. Stories of sacred groves where time moved differently. Megan didn't know whether to believe these stories literally, but she recognized truth in them. The forest did have power. She'd felt it herself during her searches, that sense of being watched, of invisible boundaries, of areas where the air felt heavier and the silence deeper. Insurance companies eventually processed death certificates based on presumption of accidental death. 7 years after disappearance, Washington law allowed families to request declaration of death. Megan resisted at first, seeing it as giving up, but Hunter convinced her it was necessary for practical reasons: Brandon's estate, Dylan's college funds. Megan used the money to fund continued searches and establish a scholarship in Dylan's name for students planning to study environmental science. But the money felt like blood payment for losses she refused to acknowledge. As years passed, the case joined the ranks of regional legends. Experienced hikers would mention the Mitchell disappearance when discussing wilderness safety. Don't venture off marked trails. Always tell someone your exact route. Carry emergency supplies. The story served as a reminder of how quickly the mountains could claim even experienced outdoorsmen. But for those who had known Brandon and Dylan personally, it remained an open wound that refused to heal. Time moved on. Indifferent to human suffering, new missing persons cases demanded attention. The wilderness continued its ancient patterns. Tourists still hiked Olympic National Forest, largely unaware of the mysteries it held. But deep in those mountains, something waited. Something that would eventually be found by a man just trying to do his job. Tyler West had been working Olympic National Forest for over 20 years. At 53, he was one of the most experienced loggers in the region. Known for his ability to navigate challenging terrain, his weathered hands knew the feel of every type of tree. This September morning in 2016, 12 years almost to the day since the Mitchell disappearance, he was surveying a stand of mature pines marked for selective harvest. Routine work, the kind he'd performed hundreds of times before. But as he began his survey, something caught his attention. About 200 yards off the main cutting zone, partially hidden by 12 years of new growth, he spotted what looked like artificial colouring, bright blue fabric that stood out against earth tones. Tyler shut down his chainsaw and approached on foot, pushing through brush. Douglas fir saplings had grown thick. Blackberry brambles caught at his clothing, but curiosity drove him forward. The fabric turned out to be part of what had once been a high-quality camping tent, now weather-beaten and partially collapsed, covered in moss and forest debris. But this wasn't just another piece of abandoned gear. Tyler had found enough of that over the years to recognize the difference. The tents sat at the center of a carefully constructed campsite, a sophisticated firing built with rocks positioned for maximum heat efficiency. Food containers still hung from branches at precise heights designed to protect them from bears. A makeshift latrine had been dug at an appropriate distance. Everything indicated not just survival but extended habitation by someone who knew exactly what they were doing. Someone had lived here, not for days or weeks, but possibly for months, maybe even longer. The tent had been modified extensively. Extra guidelines had been added using shoelaces and strips of leather. Patches covered tiers, repairs made with duct tape and scavenged materials. The modifications showed a clear progression. Early repairs were neat and careful, later ones increasingly desperate and improvised. The firing showed signs of extensive use. Multiple layers of ash and charcoal built up over time. The rocks were positioned to create a natural windbreak while allowing maximum oxygen flow. Around the campsite perimeter, Tyler found evidence of toolmaking. Branches had been sharpened into spears using a knife initially, but also using rocks when better tools wore out. Pieces of metal had been fashioned into crude tools. A broken tent pole had been hammered flat to create a knife-like blade. This wasn't casual camping. This was survival at its most desperate and most impressive. He pulled out his cell phone. His call to emergency services was brief and urgent. He provided GPS coordinates and a preliminary description. While waiting for authorities, Tyler continued his careful examination. Near the tent's main entrance, partially hidden by years of accumulated pine needles, he found something that made his blood run cold. Scratched into a piece of bark that had been carefully stripped from a nearby tree and preserved under the tent's overhang, barely visible after years of weather exposure, were two names carved with painstaking effort: Brandon and Dylan. Below the names, a date, September 2004, and below that, words that would haunt him forever. If you find this, tell them we tried. Tell them we survived longer than anyone thought possible. Tell them the forest kept us. The implications hit Tyler like a physical blow. He'd lived in this region long enough to remember the massive search operation 12 years earlier. The father and son who had vanished without trace. The helicopters, the hundreds of volunteers. The story had become part of local folklore. But if these names belonged to Brandon and Dylan Mitchell, and Tyler knew in his gut that they did, then everything everyone had believed was wrong. They hadn't died quickly in those first critical days. They had survived. They had adapted. They had built this remarkable shelter and lived in these mountains for a period that defied all conventional wisdom. The question that would haunt investigators was simple but impossible to answer. If they had survived for so long, building this sophisticated camp just miles from where search teams had concentrated efforts, where were they now? What had finally claimed them after they'd managed to survive for so impossibly long? And why, despite all their obvious skill and determination, had they never found their way back to civilization that was never more than a hard day's hike in any direction? When the first responders arrived 2 hours later, Tyler led them to the site. Sheriff's deputies, Forest Service investigators, search and rescue coordinators who'd participated in the original operation. They stood in silence, taking in details that rewrote everything they thought they knew about the case. Detective Sarah Chen had been a junior officer during the original search, now a seasoned investigator with the county sheriff's department. She'd never forgotten Brandon and Dylan Mitchell, had carried their case file in the back of her mind for 12 years, had wondered countless times what really happened in those mountains. Now she stood at the campsite and felt chills run down her spine. "This changes everything," she said quietly. They didn't just survive. They thrived. For months, maybe longer. The question is, why they never made it out. The forensic team began their methodical work, photographing every detail, cataloguing every item, looking for any clue that might explain what happened after the camp was built. But the forest had reclaimed much of the evidence. 12 years of weather and growth had obscured or destroyed anything not carefully preserved. They found more carved messages on other pieces of bark, preserved in waterproof bags made from tent material, notes that read like a survival journal, fragmentary, desperate, increasingly incoherent. Day 14. Still can't find the lake. Every direction looks the same. Day 28. Caught fish in stream. Dylan getting stronger. We can do this. Day 47. Something's wrong with this place. Landmarks keep changing. Compass readings don't make sense. Day 63. Built better shelter. Winter coming. We'll wait it out. Spring will make it easier. Day unknown. Lost track. Dylan thinks we should stay here. Build permanent camp. Wait for rescue. He might write. The final message, the one Tyler had found, was dated months after the first. How many months they couldn't determine. The handwriting was barely legible, the words carved with obvious difficulty. Megan Phillips received the call on a Tuesday afternoon, 12 years after her son had vanished. The detective's voice was careful, measured. She'd found something. Megan needed to come to the sheriff's office. When they showed her the photographs, Megan's hands began to shake. That was Brandon's handwriting. She'd seen it on birthday cards and custody documents and shopping lists for a decade and a half. She'd recognize it anywhere. They survived, she whispered. My baby survived. But the detective had to tell her the rest. They'd found the campsite, found the messages, but they hadn't found Brandon and Dylan, not their remains, not any indication of what finally happened to them, just the evidence of their remarkable survival, and then nothing. The case remained officially unsolved. Theories multiplied. Some investigators believed they'd finally succumbed to the elements, that their remains were somewhere in the vast wilderness, scattered by animals, reclaimed by the forest. Others thought they might have attempted to leave the camp during winter, gotten caught in a storm, fallen into a ravine that search teams hadn't found. The tribal elders had their own explanation. Agnes Clearwater spoke to reporters who asked about the strange aspects of the case, the way the scent trail had vanished, the way the camp sat so close to where searchers had looked but was never found, the messages about landmarks changing and compass readings making no sense. The forest took them, she said simply. Not cruelly, not maliciously, but took them nonetheless. Some places in these mountains exist between worlds. Time doesn't work the same way. Space doesn't follow the rules you expect. The old ones knew to avoid these places, knew the signs. But newcomers don't listen to the warnings. Most dismissed her words as superstition. But those who'd participated in the original search weren't so sure. They'd felt it themselves. That oppressive presence, that sense of invisible boundaries, the way the forest seemed to actively hide its secrets. The discovery brought no closure, only more questions. Megan visited the campsite once, escorted by park rangers, stood in the clearing where her son had lived for months, touched the fire ring he'd built with his own hands, read his father's messages carved into bark. She'd thought finding answers would ease the pain, but it only made it worse. Knowing they'd survived so long, fought so hard, come so close to making it through, and then vanished anyway, claimed by mountains that refused to give up their dead. The campsite was left undisturbed, marked on maps as a memorial. Occasionally hikers would find it, would stand in the clearing and try to imagine what Brandon and Dylan had endured, would read the messages and feel the weight of their struggle. The forest kept its secrets, kept its promise. It had called them deeper than they meant to go, had kept them longer than anyone thought possible, and in the end had claimed them completely. Brandon and Dylan Mitchell became more than a cautionary tale. They became evidence of something deeper, something that defied rational explanation. A reminder that for all our technology and expertise and careful planning, there are still places in this world that operate according to their own ancient logic, where human understanding reaches its limits, where the wilderness remains fundamentally terrifyingly wild. The case files remained open. Every few years, new search efforts would be organized. New technology applied, new theories explored, but the forest yielded nothing more, just that single campsite, those carved messages, that evidence of impossible survival. And somewhere in the Olympic National Forest, in mountains that have claimed countless lives over centuries, 2 more names were added to the list of those who'd ventured too far, who'd crossed invisible boundaries, who'd learned too late that some places don't want to be explored, don't want to be understood, don't want to be tamed. The forest had kept them, and the forest would never let them go. The case remains officially unsolved. The Jefferson County Sheriff's Department lists it as an open investigation, cold case, but still active, still accepting tips and new information. The questions that haunt everyone involved. Did Brandon and Dylan die because Olympic National Forest was too vast? Too unforgiving? Because the terrain defeated even the most thorough search efforts? Or did they die because someone who could have helped chose not to? Because evidence of their location was deliberately concealed? Because human interference condemned them to months of desperate survival followed by unexplained disappearance? Was this a tragedy of nature, or a tragedy of human choice? The Mitchell family believes they deserve to know. Megan Phillips, now 63, continues searching for answers. She visits the campsite regularly, maintains contact with Detective Chen, pushes for continued investigation. "My son survived for months out there," she said in a 2018 interview. "He and his father built a camp, made tools, found water, fought to stay alive with everything they had. They didn't give up. So I won't give up either. Someone knows what really happened, and I won't stop until I find out who. If you have any knowledge about the Brandon and Dylan Mitchell case, please contact the Jefferson County Sheriff's Department. Any detail, no matter how small, might be the piece that finally solves this mystery. If you were part of the 2004 search effort and remember anything unusual about grid assignments or volunteer behavior, your information could be crucial. If you knew Mark Holloway in 2004 and remember anything about his activities that September, investigators want to hear from you. The truth is out there, somewhere in those mountains or in someone's memory, waiting to be discovered. This case raises questions that go beyond one family's tragedy, questions about search and rescue protocols, about volunteer oversight, about how we respond when people go missing in wilderness areas. Could the original search have been more thorough? Should there be better tracking of volunteer assignments and movements? Are there gaps in the system that allowed something to fall through the cracks? Or is this simply a case of impossible odds, of terrain so challenging and forest so vast that even the best efforts couldn't penetrate its secrets? We want to hear your theories, not accusations, not naming suspects, but thoughtful analysis of what might have happened, what evidence suggests, what questions remain unanswered. Leave your thoughts in the comments below. Respectful discussion only. Remember that real families are still grieving these losses. Real people are still searching for answers. And if you want to see more deep dives into cold cases, more investigations that ask the questions others won't, subscribe to this channel. Hit that notification bell. Every week we examine unsolved mysteries with thorough research and respectful analysis. The Olympic National Forest continues its ancient patterns, indifferent to human tragedy, indifferent to our need for closure and answers. Hikers still walk those trails. Some stop at the Mitchell Memorial Campsite, read the carved messages, try to imagine what Brandon and Dylan endured during their final months. The forest keeps its secrets, but the investigation continues. Because somewhere in those mountains, or in someone's conscience, the truth is waiting. Justice delayed is not justice denied. Not yet. Not while people like Detective Chen and Megan Phillips continue asking questions, continue demanding answers. Brandon and Dylan Mitchell deserved to come home. They deserved to be found in those critical early days when rescue was still possible. They deserve the truth, even 12 years later. Even if that truth is painful, even if it reveals failures in the system designed to save them. The case remains open, the questions remain unanswered, but the search for truth never ends. Thank you for watching, and remember, in cold cases, time doesn't erase evidence, it only tests our commitment to finding justice.